In the early years of World War II, as Nazi Germany launched its devastating invasion of the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa, the question of why the United States didn't send troops to support the USSR is one that has intrigued historians for decades. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, was one of the key Allied powers, and yet the United States and its Western allies did not intervene directly with ground forces in Soviet territory. This decision was based on a complex mix of political strategy, distrust, logistics, and differing war aims. Let's explore the reasons why the United States, despite its enormous industrial and military power, refrained from sending troops to the Soviet Union during this pivotal time in history. Geopolitical tensions and mistrust. Despite being united against a common enemy, the ideological chasm between the Soviet Union and the United States was vast. Stalin's USSR was a communist dictatorship, while the United States was a capitalist democracy. These two worldviews were fundamentally opposed, and though they were able to temporarily align in their fight against fascism, deep-seated mistrust ran through their partnership. Stalin's purges, mass executions, and the secretive nature of his regime made Western leaders skeptical of Soviet intentions. Even before the war, the West had viewed the Soviet Union with suspicion. Many American politicians saw the USSR as a potential threat, one that could destabilize Europe even if Nazi Germany were defeated. In the eyes of many American leaders, Stalin was just as dangerous as Hitler, and they feared what a Soviet victory would mean for the future of Eastern Europe. For these reasons, the United States was hesitant to engage too deeply in Soviet territory. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his administration were focused on keeping Stalin as a wartime ally, but were cautious of entangling themselves too closely with the Soviet regime. The logistics nightmare, sending American troops to the Soviet Union, would have been a logistical nightmare. The Soviet Union's vast expanse, coupled with the brutal winter conditions, would have made any large-scale deployment of American forces extremely difficult. Unlike Western Europe, where the United States could easily support its troops via supply lines from the United Kingdom, sending forces to the USSR would have required navigating treacherous terrain, crossing hostile airspace, and coordinating with the notoriously disorganized Soviet military infrastructure. The United States instead chose to provide material support through the Lend-Lease Act. Under this program, the US sent billions of dollars worth of equipment, vehicles, food, and other resources to the Soviet Union to aid in its war effort. This was seen as a more practical way of assisting without the enormous risks that would come with sending American troops to the Eastern Front. Focus on other theaters of war. While the Soviet Union was bearing the brunt of the fighting on the Eastern Front, the United States had its own priorities elsewhere. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, America's primary focus was on defeating Japan in the Pacific. This required significant resources and manpower, leaving little room for a potential involvement in the Soviet theater. At the same time, the US was preparing for a large-scale invasion of Western Europe, which eventually culminated in the D-Day landings in June 1944. The planning and execution of Operation Overlord consumed a massive amount of the US military's attention, and sending troops to support the USSR would have stretched American forces thin at a critical time. There was also the question of military strategy. The US and Britain believed that the best way to defeat Nazi Germany was to open a second front in the West, forcing Hitler to fight on two fronts and dividing his resources. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was adamant that the Allies should open this front as soon as possible to relieve pressure on their forces. However, the Western Allies delayed the invasion, focusing first on campaigns in North Africa and Italy. By the time the second front was opened in France, the Soviet Union had already gained the upper hand on the Eastern Front, making the need for American troops in the USSR less pressing. Soviet self-sufficiency and nationalism. Another important reason why the United States didn't send troops to the USSR was that Stalin didn't want them there. The Soviet leader was fiercely protective of his country's sovereignty and saw foreign troops on Soviet soil as a potential threat to his power. Throughout the war, Stalin made it clear that the Red Army would be the one to liberate Soviet territory and that Soviet forces would lead the charge into Germany. Stalin's mistrust of Western intentions was profound, and he feared that American or British troops might interfere in Soviet internal affairs or attempt to influence post-war decisions. The Soviet Union had a history of foreign invasions, and Stalin was determined to prevent any foreign power from gaining influence within his borders. Allowing American troops into the USSR would have meant acknowledging that the Soviet Union couldn't win the war on its own, something that Stalin was unwilling to do. This self-sufficiency was not only a matter of pride for Stalin, but also a tool to solidify his hold on power. By framing the war as a heroic Soviet effort to defeat fascism, Stalin was able to unite his people under a common cause and suppress internal dissent. American troops on Soviet soil could have undermined this narrative and weakened his control. Even as the war raged on, both the United States and the Soviet Union were already thinking about the post-war world. Roosevelt, Churchill, Churchill and Stalin had met several times to discuss what would happen once Nazi Germany was defeated, and it was clear that both sides had different visions for Europe's future. The United States was committed to the idea of self-determination and democracy in Europe, while Stalin was determined to create a buffer zone of friendly communist states in Eastern Europe to protect the USSR from future invasions. This fundamental disagreement meant that the US was cautious about getting too involved in Soviet affairs during the war, as it was clear that post-war tensions were already brewing. By refraining from sending troops to the USSR, the United States avoided the potential for direct conflict with Soviet forces. This decision allowed the Allies to maintain a fragile partnership with Stalin during the war, but it also set the stage for the Cold War that followed. By refraining from sending troops to the USSR, the United States avoided the potential for direct conflict with Soviet forces. This decision allowed the Allies to maintain a fragile partnership with Stalin during the war, but it also set the stage for the Cold War that followed. The Cold War, which lasted for nearly 5 decades, was rooted in the deep-seated distrust between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both nations emerged from World War II as global superpowers, but their fundamentally opposing ideologies, capitalism and democracy versus communism and authoritarianism, ensured that peace would remain elusive. The seeds of tension, the seeds of post-war tension, were sown during the war itself. The United States, United Kingdom, and Soviet Union had vastly different goals for the future of Europe. While the Western Allies sought to establish democratic governments across the continent, Stalin had a very different vision. For Stalin, the primary concern was security. The USSR had been invaded multiple times over the previous centuries, and Stalin was determined that it would never happen again. His solution was to create a buffer zone of communist-friendly governments in Eastern Europe, ensuring that any future aggressor would have to fight through those states before reaching the Soviet Union. This clash of visions became apparent during high-level meetings such as the Tehran Conference in 1943 and the Yalta Conference in 1945. While these meetings were held under the guise of cooperation, the underlying tensions were clear. Roosevelt and Churchill pressed Stalin on the issue of self-determination for countries in Eastern Europe, but Stalin remained adamant that the Soviet Union would control the fate of its neighboring states. By the time the war ended, the Soviet Union had effectively established control over much of Eastern Europe, setting the stage for the Iron Curtain to fall across the continent. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences, a fragile alliance crumbles. The Yalta Conference in February 1945 was one of the last major meetings between the three wartime leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. It was here that the division of Europe became most apparent. While agreements were made about the post-war reconstruction of Germany and the establishment of the United Nations, the question of Eastern Europe loomed large. Roosevelt, in failing health and hoping for continued Soviet cooperation in the war against Japan, made significant concessions to Stalin, particularly regarding Poland. In exchange for Soviet assistance in the Pacific, the West tacitly accepted Soviet control over much of Eastern Europe. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, held after Germany's surrender, the divisions became even starker. By this time, Roosevelt had passed away, and Harry Truman had assumed the presidency. Truman was less willing to compromise with Stalin, especially after the successful test of the atomic bomb in New Mexico. The US now had the ultimate weapon, and Truman believed this gave him an upper hand in negotiations